I know I've had the experience of being so tired of trying to explain what I believe to be true and correct and right. It's like social justice, right? Like police brutality. Like you can only say so much, and then hearing my experiences being dismissed, or other folks experience being dismissed. I've had to walk away from some conversations and come back. But that was the way that I could keep my peace. And we've never, the person and I that I referred to, we never got to a place of agreement, right? And I think that the reality is we have to understand that there's no such thing as that. We are all so different, and that's for a reason. We are all unique, and that's for a reason. We are all put here on this earth to solve a problem. And the way that our roads cross doesn't mean that that interaction is supposed to be bliss. Like the fact that if we walk around thinking that, then I feel like sometimes we're being very naive. But I believe that everyone gets to a point where, to the point of this conversation around peace, where you're walking away from something that you can't find peace in, and it's okay. And that's the struggle of getting to the peace that I need to get to, because in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, all that happens more than not, right? And in order to continue to do the work, you have to be able to understand the cognitive dissonance, disagreement, never being able to reach certain people is inevitable. Like that's a part of the process, and that's where that hope comes in, because I'm running a race in my lane, and I'm gonna give it to the baton for the next generation, right? And it's their job to hit mindsets differently than I've ever approached it to be.
Yeah, you're hitting on to a topic. You mentioned cognitive dissonance a couple of times, and I think the psychology of it is really interesting in what we're talking about, because in the spirit of, right, let's take one of those topics. Let's just hit it, right? Police brutality. Let's just take that one, right? Let's say you're in a conversation with somebody and they don't get it, right? It's they just don't, they're dismissive of it. They don't buy into it. And maybe let's even say they're not horrible people, quote unquote, right? They don't seem to be people who just have hate in their heart, but they just don't get it. They're missing it. What I find makes this so hard, and I'm curious if you agree, given all the work you've done in it, is to embody and kind of to use the phrase, to be the change we want to see in the world. You almost have to, it puts you at a disadvantage, because if you react to their dismissiveness at the same level and kind of dismiss them and say, you obviously don't know what you're talking about, even though that might be justified and right in that moment, you're now giving them that out to say, well, I don't have to do it. I could just stay with my belief. So you almost have to give in a little bit to say, all right, let me understand what you're saying. Let me try and understand your perspective and how you got to this point in the world where you think what I'm saying is crazy. And that seems so twisted that responsibility is something that you or whoever has to do in that case. And that's the stuff that I think about. That's like, how do we ever make this work if that's what's being asked of people? Because that seems like an impossible ask in that situation.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, because now we're asking people to carry a burden that isn't theirs,
Yes.
right? Which can be very traumatic, and it can be triggering. And I've experienced it. And then you become the voice for all,
Yeah.
right? And so then they're coming to you about a person as if we are all monolithic
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And so no, that is a really good point. And I think that again, going back to peace, it's in this moment, and I've had to get to this space because I realized that peace stopped for me at work,
Mhm.
because I was pouring so much of myself at work into work that when I got home, there was no more peace for everyone else in the house. Right. And so I started to realize who I was pouring into, who I was influencing, not just at work, with the people that love me back. Right. And I started to realize, how do I pivot out at the moment, but pivot back in? And so in order for me to recognize the triggers, my traumas, being dismissed often, having to explain, being considered as the Black person that speaks for all Black people, right? How do I have conversations, ask the questions that lead to, folks unpacking it for themselves and their experiences outside, even because sometimes, going back to my classroom experiences, as an administrator, I evaluated people. I will go into in a classroom. If there's a terrible teacher, I had to be careful about not just how I talk to this teacher in front of the kids, but how I talk to the teacher outside of the kids. Because when I'm not there, I need you to treat these kids right. Right. And so it's this balance of holding people accountable. It's a balance of having conversations that recognize folks in their humanity, but being able to pivot back into the conversation when necessary to unpack once folks are able to process things through. Sometimes people need time, and I don't think we recognize that. And sometimes people might need to go and talk to other people who may say something different or add more to them to think about. And I think going back to your point about control, I had to get to a space of understanding that the influence that I had in that moment and that I want to come back to doesn't necessarily mean I have to control the conversation. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have to control their outcome and their belief. My piece is me being able to, push you to think differently and to continue to have a conversation and develop the environment where you at least want to continue to have a conversation. If I can get you to keep coming back, I have more opportunity than not to be able to unpack this thing that we're going through. But if you never come back, then I've missed an opportunity, right? And so now I need to go back and check myself and my own assumption and my own beliefs around what I'm actually practicing.